Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from the innovators leading the charge. Today, I'm joined by John Cooper, CEO of Bar Technologies, a company that has taken its roots from America's Cup racing and applied cutting-edge design and data science to commercial shipping. Their wind wings are already proving themselves at sea by slashing fuel consumptions and carbon emissions on real-world voyages. We're going to talk about how wind propulsion fits into the decarbonization puzzle, why smaller fleet operators may stand to gain the most, and how digital tools are making wind harvesting practical, predictable, and safe. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Really happy to be here. I'm a big fan of the show, so got my breakfast tea. Ready to chat. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Really looking forward to this chat. Let's just start with you and your background a little bit. And your background is in F1 and other things outside of maritime. Let's talk about how you came over into the shipping side. And I'd like to do that because, unlike myself, there's a lot of people who've been in shipping for 20, 30, 40, 50 years and still going strong. But the industry needs folks from the outside. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm a maritime guy, as you said, but I have got some big F1 roots. I joined McLaren Racing in 2005 and had 14 adrenaline-filled years with the team, starting off in finance and commercials and ending up as their chief business officer. And that's certainly where my intrigue in both engineering and commercializing engineering came from. So, my job was not just about finance. It was actually about bringing technology to the car. And there's some real parallels that I didn't know about then, but now I really do know about. Formula One, of course, it's all about performance and getting that last 1%, and lap times differ by 0.1 of a second, and performance really matters. And over the years, the FIA, who govern that sport, had spent a lot of time actually reducing testing, and the reason that they did that was to actually promote the simulation tools. So all of the Formula One teams started investing in simulation, from driver and loop simulation. So that's when the driver actually drives a driving simulator, computational fluid dynamics to simulate a wind tunnel, the wind tunnel itself. So lots of different tools, such that when the F1 cars were finally unleashed onto the track, they were as good as they could be and ready to race. And you can draw some really very strong parallels from that to what we're doing in BAR technologies. But before I go into that, one other thing happened to me in McLaren Racing, which really helped me shape my future. And that was actually McLaren Racing sits as one company. We already had a road car company called McLaren Automotive, but we were creating a huge amount of IP racing and not really able to use that. So we started another business called McLaren Applied Technologies. And the job of that business was to look at the IP created by the race team and actually look at bringing that out into the real world, whether it was through the automotive manufacturers or other technology businesses. So I was already really used to taking what was cutting edge technology and applying it to the real world. And actually, I owe my transfer to a guy called Martin Whitmarsh, who was the team principal of the team. And he joined Ben Ainsley for his 2017 America's Cup campaign. And then after that, they did something similar. They created BAR technologies and said, John, you need to come and run it.
So that's really fascinating on how you got to that road, excuse the pun, from the automotive side, the high competition automotive side, to really high competition sailing side, which is kind of its own little industry. And when you talk to industry people like myself or others, that is to say, those that worked on the ships, those that are dealing with bauxite, bulk bauxite, or 130,000 tons of crude oil out of West Africa, America's Cup is one of the furthest things from their mind, other than, oh, look, they're doing something over there. Let's make sure we don't hit them. I mean, it's pretty much the interaction there. And I'm downplaying a little bit. Obviously, a lot of people probably sail and have an interest. But, talk about that transition, and not only kind of your transition, but really in the form of BIR technologies and the industry of taking this high level, really very high level, very specific, data driven. It almost seems like into future technologies and applying it to, ships that are traveling 13 knots, with 20, 30, 40, 100,000 tons of cargo on.
Yeah. Well, firstly, the transition was very interesting, not least amongst the family. I remember coming home from a day at the Formula One factory and saying, guys, I'm going to leave Formula One and I'm going to join a decarbonization business that has links to America's Cup. And my daughter said, good on you, Dad. That is a fantastic move. I love the fact that you're going to go to do some decarbonization. And my son said, Father, have you fallen on your head?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Can I
Dad,
talk you out of it?
we're not going to get tickets anymore. What's going on here?
Yeah. Exactly. So anyway, they got over it quite quickly, or my son did. And I joined, as I say, BAR Technologies. And actually, there is incredible parallels to the McLaren Applied story that I was telling you earlier, Chris, that actually America's Cup really does attract the top breed of marine engineers, whether they're naval arcs or FEA simulators or whatever they are. It really does bring the top people to the sport, and people often call it the F1 of the sea. And actually, you'll be familiar with tank testing, which is where big commercial models go and actually go up against the waves and tow it through and decide what the resistance of the hull is, etc., etc. And the America's Cup teams, they're hyper competitive, just like Formula One teams. And to ensure that their America's Cup boats were the best when they finally got launched, they were booking up all of the towing tanks in the world. And that's not good for commercial shipping. So the organisers of the America's Cup said, let's ban the use of tanks. And that meant that all the America's Cup teams had to do exactly what the Formula One teams were doing, and then build really fantastic simulation tools such that they weren't using these physical assets that should be reserved for the big ships, but they were using digital tool sets to design their vessels. And it was that transition that enabled us to create BAR Technologies. So we actually said, now we've got a breadth of fantastic software simulation assets, and we can utilize those to shortcut the design of marine technology. So we took that from BAR, Ben Ainsley Racing, and created BAR Technologies, and that's the first part of our history.
Let's unpack that a little bit more. Is as you're going through and saying, okay, we're going to start to prove this digitally. When you go to customers and you say, hey, we've done this simulation, we've done this, how is their reaction? Because you're going from F1, and maybe you got some pushback in the garage or pushback, on the dock side from folks who've been around for, no, we've done it this way. This is the way it works. How do you know that this is going to work when it's applied to the road, to the, ocean conditions? How do you talk to clients, and what kind of reactions did they have when you said, this is how we're going to be developing and building this technology that, by the way, is going to go on your asset that's, a $50,000 new building or $80,000 new building. And we're confident it's going to help you in terms of emissions. Talk to me a little bit about some of those conversations, because I think that that's kind of interesting, because it goes to the greater issue that I think Maritime faces, which is actually change management, whether it's decarbonization, and we'll get to the second part of that, digitalization.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. Great question, Chris. There is a lot of skeptics, and there still are. There are a lot of people that are very, very happy buying a hull that's actually 30 years old and not changing it and not looking to decarbonize, and not actually understanding that you can use these new tool sets and not have to go through a real traditional method of developing a hull or changing a rudder or a new propeller or indeed a wing to put on top of the ship. So it does take some convincing, and you need to find a soulmate that sort of understands the technology and the business that you're targeting. And we were lucky enough to do one of our first projects actually with a company called Princess Yachts, who are quite a traditional motor yachting business. And we actually convinced them to take the vessel that was probably at the racier end of their range and put some foils on the bottom. So, traditionally reserved for the sort of gin and tonic brigade. Actually, we made that yacht a little bit racier, a little bit more sort of four-wheel drive for the sea, saved it 30% of fuel. And actually, that was our first sort of case study that we were able to point at when we were actually describing the techniques that we use. And then actually our chairman was involved in the offshore wind industry and actually challenged us to change the crew transfer vessels that took the technicians to those wind farms. And, that was a a very interesting conundrum as to how to do that, and we call it ShipSEAT, which is our sort of a digital twin, which then doubles up as a design tool and basically bombards design tools with millions of different potential designs and hones that down to something that's practical and can be made. And actually all of the crew transfer vessels are high buoyancy catamarans because they bring a lot of weight, not just people, but load to the wind farms. So the challenge was actually getting an alternative vessel that wasn't so reactive to the sea state, because these technicians are largely electricians that could be in a sports hall one week and then they're in the middle of the ocean the next week. And seasickness is something to be avoided, that's for sure. So we actually developed something. When I say we program the system to deliver something, and that was a very slender main hull with a swath style outrigger. That's a sort of a torpedo buoyancy unit below the water, and a couple of foil systems. And that all sounds technical until I sometimes describe it as a giant Polynesian canoe. Those guys knew what they were doing when they were designing their fishing vessel, which was one of the most stable things, certainly more stable than a canoe, if you think about it. And that was the Bartek 30, and that was our second project. And then we went on to wind wings and things like that, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a minute.
We talk a lot about decarbonization technology, especially whether it's this type of technology that gets us a lower footprint or things like ammonia and these other types of fuel. Ultimately, again, using a racing or a car type of analogy, where the rubber hits the road is the seafarer, the person that has to live with the decision that's made, that has to live with the new carbon, the new type of fuel. Have you had any of that firsthand experiences about this sort of stuff? Because I think that's interesting as well.
Yeah, that's some of my favorite interactions, actually. We can interact with the technical people and the owners of the businesses, but actually the users, we were talking about the technicians. That crew transfer vessel went straight on to charter for Equinor. So it's going backwards and forwards in some of the biggest seas, the North Sea, and actually talking to the technicians when they come back from their week away. They say, well, I don't know how that boat does that, but it's incredibly stable and the sea was very rough. And it's that sort of feedback that's probably the most proud that you get, all the way to the big vessels that have got wind wings on, the 300-meter Kamsarmax with 4 wings. You talk to the crew on that and they're genuinely proud. They're saying, well, last week we were on a Newcastle Max, didn't have any sails on it. Now we're with this beautiful thing that actually, we get radioed in 3 or 4 times a day, and people are congratulating us on our vessel, and that makes us feel proud. And we can see we're saving loads of fuel, and it needs to be explained to us, the conversion between marine fuel and CO2. But, we can go home and tell people we've just saved 20 tons of CO2 today. So people are changing, and people sort of interact with us in very different ways. But I love talking to the crews of the vessels that we work with.
Yeah, I think that can't be forgotten in any sort of application, whether it's more of a digital first application or a little bit of where that all comes together, a little bit of digital, like you said, with some digital twins and some other things, to more of the actual hardware on the ship, like the wings or retrofitting. Speaking of which, one of the interesting things that I read through a little bit, and that you mentioned, was a report that came out earlier in the year. I think something called UCL Energy. And they were talking a little bit about there is a chance that ships may get prematurely scrapped just because of basically consumption, that they're going to be over consuming. They're not going to be competitive enough. They may fall out of favor in that realm. Now, I think there's a lot to be seen, because it always seems to be ways around that. And I'm wearing my trading hat. I spent, as the audience may know, I spent 18 years on a commercial desk, mostly as a broker, but as a charter and as an owner, and realizing, you can't use that ship, but somebody may be able to use it. And then you end up having two markets, kind of like what we're seeing with sanctioned ships and gray ships and all this other stuff. But talk a little bit about some of your efforts and what you've seen in the marketplace to kind of overcome that. And that really gets into things like the retrofitting as well as the wind-assisted propulsion, because that changes the profile of any ship that's going to be, that's going to be out there and consuming energy and producing CO2 and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got mixed feelings with all of that. Obviously early retirement of a vessel, that's probably not a very green thing to do, when you think about, how much energy it takes to build a new ship. But having said that, you've got to start somewhere, and you've got to put rules in that ensures the future ships are built with greater thought process in terms of sustainability. So the rules are there for very good intention. I mean, luckily for the legacy fleet, and let's concentrate on that a bit for the retrofits, as you suggest, it is very good that there are some good instruments that can improve the CII, the XI of these vessels. Obviously, hull coatings have long been established as a good fuel saver. We can talk about air lubrication as to whether that's worth the 5% claimed or the 2% that's the probable. We could never certainly analyse it to some of the claims, but even so, it certainly works. You can talk about shaft alternators and different uses of the main engine, but wind is certainly one of them. New fuels will come, but it's a big job to change the propulsion system of these vessels, of course. So I think I would say this, but actually I think it's true that wind is the biggest lever that the legacy fleet have got. You can actually change the fuel consumption. Certainly in Bartek's view, we sit at the top of the market at 1.5 tons of fuel a day per wing. So, that's a really serious amount of fuel, and you can really get one or even two level changes on your CII and EEXI. So that automatically means that a ship that you might have to retire in 10 years, you can run for a further 15. And even take these wings from one vessel and put them on another vessel, because we designed them for 25 years. So if you've got a lady that needs a 5-year extension, you could use the wings on her and then put them on a different vessel afterwards. So, we are really focusing, and indeed our first 2 introductions of wings were both retrofits. We did a Kamsamax for Mitsubishi and with 2 wings, and actually we did a 4-wing retrofit on a Newcastle Max for Bergie Bulk, who then became a shareholder. They liked it so much.
Well, that's a good way to build out your base and scope and everything. I think at the end of the day, that's definitely a good way to do that. One of the other parts of this equation as well, and you keep mentioning CII and EEXI and those other things, of course, it's either FuelEU or EU ETS, where you actually get a significant benefit in terms of your carbon tax, or however it's worded, if you have wind as a propulsion. And I always get them confused, and I apologize to all my fuel gurus out there. But so that has to be another kind of positive thing that at least, owners are starting to pay more attention to, as that's becoming more and more prevalent in their trade.
Absolutely. As you quite rightly point out, ETS and FuelEU is something that's been biting the industry in a very positive way for 3 years now. When you trade a ship into the EU, then you do have to pay a penalty tax, and basically using wind has a double benefit. One, you use less fuel, and therefore you're paying tax on less fuel. And actually, as you say, there is an extra reward factor for using wind, and that's up to 5% of the tax that you pay. So the benefits of using wind are double for that. And actually, you've got to admire the EU, because they collect all of that money that's paid in and then give it out as grants for people looking for sustainability projects. So, it's a for good pool of tax, which is good. But actually, even more so now, the IMO is busy writing MEPC 83, which is the first time there's a global carbon tax in the maritime industry set at $100 a ton of CO2. And then if your ship is really dirty, it's $318 a ton. So there's a lot of owners really with interest peaked now. And of course, there's a little bit of drafting to go. And there's a certain president that doesn't quite like it. But actually, I think we will get through that eventually. I think we'll get through the MEPC drafting, which happens in October, and then that will come into, let's say, IMO law after that. But there are some political hurdles to overcome, of course.
Yeah, we'll see how that all pans out. I maybe the winds will change again here, because
let's hope so.
I think if anything that outside of the U.S. they have to realize is that sometimes you just need to move forward, whether it's Paris Agreement or other things, as they see fit. And if the U.S. that sometimes has been a leader in these things. And certainly, I shouldn't say sometimes, has been. If you look back at OPA 90, we basically said, nope, everything on the planet's going to have double hulls. And I remember hearing some of those debates. Well, we could get it. We could do this. We could do this. And they're like, nope, everything on the planet's going to be a double hull. Here's a phase-in period. Thank you very much. You're going to live with it. And that was, that came
not too long ago.
No, not too long ago. And I think it was pretty bipartisan, and it was clear, and this is what we're going to do. We can't have this type of tragedy happen. And it happened after France. I think it was a Prestige during the phase out period, and then if you even look as recently as that, the collision, it's not collision, where the, container ship hit the U.S. ship, again, no funny business up in the North Sea, but I think a lot of that, yes, it breached both hulls, but because of the way it was configured, it was contained. It was relatively, in the grand scheme of things, I don't want to say a non-event, because I think people got killed and it was damaged, but it was probably not as severe as if it was a single hull, right, under old configuration. So I do think the U.S. has a place there.
No doubt, Chris. I know that you guys will lead again in the future, and I think that MEPC 83 will get through anyway. US Coast Guard, for instance, some of the most logical and stringent rules in the world. I went to Washington, 3 times now, to visit the Federal Coast Guard. Commander Hall, big shout out to him and his team. Really helped us ensure that the vessels can get in all the terminals in the US, and really actually acted as a stakeholder, truly interested in Wingwings and what they actually brought to the maritime community. So, there's leaders in the US, no doubt about it whatsoever.
Absolutely. And I've always looked, I have a great respect and admiration for the Coast Guard, because unlike the other armed services in the United States, the Coast Guard, and I've always explained this to people, are probably the most industry and people facing of all the different branches. And I would imagine same in other countries. I can't compare because I'm not a citizen of other countries. But if you look at the role of the U.S. Coast Guard, whether it's marine safety, environmental protection, they're all dealing with industry. It's very rare that you would have, let's say a Navy admiral or Marine Corps general deal with, someone like yourself, because they're looking at technology. Now, maybe arms, but they'll have people that deal with this, not that. And I think it's a great testament.
Amazingly professional. And by the way, Chris, the best uniform in the world. I mean, so I've had my photo taken with a few F1 stars, but I couldn't resist getting in the middle of the Top Gun guys and having a picky with them. That was fantastic.
That is a fantastic thing as well. And I appreciate your view there on the whole idea of scrapping, trying to prolong ships from a scrapping and green point of view. Let's pivot a little bit here. And this is where the interest of this podcast, and that's the digitalization and all of the savings that you have, whether it's retrofit on some of the aspects on the hull, whether it's retrofit or being native wind propulsion for the ship. Talk a little bit about getting that data and then using that data, because one of the interesting things about whether it's Formula One, whether it's America's Cup, is data is not just there and then consumed once an hour. It is something that is ongoing. Track conditions change, sea conditions change, and the skippers or the drivers are making instantaneous changes based on those factors. Wind shifts, okay, let's do this, let's do that. And they're collecting all that data, and you can look at it retroactively on a real-time basis. Talk a little bit about your experience with gathering the data, getting the data off of the ship, the commercial ship, and how you're viewing that as part of the whole decarbonization process.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about ShipSEAT, the design tool that was used to actually design Wingwings in the first place. And we use that all the way through the process. So when an owner comes to me and says, John, I want to buy Wingwings, here's the route that I'm planning to use. It's not a tramping route, it's point to point. We use a huge amount of data to decide how much fuel that owner and how much guaranteed fuel we'll actually say to the owner that they will save. And we run their vessel, with a digital twin through the voyage 600 times over the last decade, using huge amounts of hindcast weather to actually say, this is the pattern that you will experience in the future. Obviously, weather's changing a tiny bit, but it gives you a real feel for what we're doing. So that's using hindcast data, but then we use real data actually on all of the voyages. So weather routing becomes quite a big part of saving the most fuel. So, without wind wings, you're looking to avoid weather largely. You're looking at tide, you're looking at waves, and actually looking at the most smooth passage, largely on the Great Circle. But with wings, you've suddenly got two forms of propulsion. You've got your combustion engine and you've got wind wings. And therefore, actually, it's really important that every time the ship receives new grid files, new weather files, whether it's on board or whether it's in the shore-based operation teams, they actually run a new simulation to decide how much combustion engine they'll use and how much wind they will use. And that can actually mean slowing down the voyage in the first part to wait for some weather, or speeding up the voyage and going off course to actually get into some weather where you can use the wind and therefore reduce the fuel. So ShipSEAT on board, as we call it, is a very powerful tool where the captain can actually say, I'm in China, I want to be in Brazil in 60 days' time. What is my best course for reducing the ultimate amount of fuel that I can? Or actually, I don't mind, I haven't sold my cargo yet, so actually I'm going to mosey on down into that area, and I need to be in between this date and this date, and therefore ultimately save the most fuel that you can. So there's different ways that the captain and the operations team can look at that, but we're using that digital information every day. It's a very high complex calculation with a Monte Carlo simulations. Pretty similar. Okay, it's a bit slower, but very similar to the teams use in F1 when they're deciding when to make a pit stop.
I think that data, and I'll get to the second point, which is really the connectivity, right? Because then you have to have that kind of high frequency connectivity and not just, okay, Captain, we'll see you in 60 days in Brazil and get telexes, or, you have sat phones. But the connectivity part must be a very key part of what you're bringing to the table for the fleet. So that also needs, maybe it is just simply satellite phone, but it also, or Starlink. I don't know how much you guys are using that, but I imagine that's going to be a part of any sort of discussion with the ship owner.
Yes, Starlink's the favorite, there's no doubt. So we actually have a number of different web-based apps that actually you can use on board, ShipSEAT on board, telling the captain how much throttle to use and the course. So we sniff the rudder and the throttle into our systems such that we can replay the instructions to the captain. So that's the onboard bit. But actually, we want to try and make it come alive for all of the teams, whether it's your crew on the ship, whether it's the operational people on land, or whether it's the CEO of the vessel owner. So Lauren Kaji, one of the most prolific wind purchasers from Union Maritime, I want him on his phone to understand the fuel savings of the Brands Hatch, which has 3 Bartek wind wings. So he can say, great, I'm saving 6 tons of fuel today, and actually my ship is here. That's unusual, it's off course, but now I can see that weather front, and now I understand why. So there's all sorts of data. You've got to look at your audience and decide, the fidelity of that data and the use of that data. But actually, we're finding the crews are becoming really actively engaged with what they're doing, and actually you can see them wanting to save more fuel for personal pride, but also for some target setting from their bosses ashore. So, there is a lot of data being used, and it is high fidelity.
I wonder, is it also a little bit gamification? Because that was something that we got into a little bit on a previous podcast where we talked about gamification of, and I forgot what it was, but it was that as well, which is just, hey, we got 2 ships here, exactly outfitted. Let's see if we could do, who could perform better. Again, with always keeping in mind safety, timing, charter party terms, all those sort of things as well.
Absolutely. Make no mistake, I'd like to do that digitally, but I want a race. So, there are other wind propulsion businesses out there. I actually want Bartek wind wings on one vessel, a similar hull and some of the other technology on another, and I want to race across the Atlantic. It might be the Formula One days still, but, actually that would be an immense amount of fun.
That
for
would be
sure.
a bit. Yeah, they used to have something called, I think, a blue ribbon or something,
Yeah.
where the SS United States, we just scrapped, held that record for a million years, and it was a steam ship. It was giant. One of the propellers, actually, at my alma mater, SUNY Maritime, they actually have one of the propellers. And if you look how big the ship is, which it isn't big, and then there was a lot of pictures earlier in the year, at the end of last year, of the ship getting towed from Philadelphia to a scrapyard, and it looked a little bit like a ghost ship because it hasn't been painted, but you see that in comparison to how big some of these cruise ships, and there is no comparison, but it held that record for a very, very long time. One of the things that we kind of run into a little bit in the industry, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is when you have this type of technology, whether it's hardware, software, a lot of times if somebody takes it on board, it's a Maersk, it's one of these big stalwarts of the community. But as I've stated before, Joy Basu, who was on the podcast, and some others, is that there's a giant long tail of ship owners and operators that make up really 40, 50, 60% of the industry in terms of fleet size or deadweight, however you look at it, that are not that really the few hundred ships that these companies have. And that's a real target-rich environment. I'd love to hear kind of how you approach them, what your view is with dealing with those companies, because they make up a incredible amount of TAM.
Yeah, absolutely. And the real answer is you can't talk to everyone, so you've got to pick the people that are most likely to be early adopters. The Greek community probably aren't the early adopters, but we've got people in Greece talking to all of the valuable owners there. The other way of getting to the market is actually getting on the makers lists, so getting to all of the shipyards and ensuring that we've got good relationships with them, such that they are now not reticent to put wind wings on vessels because they just want to shell the ships, the vanilla ships, but now actually see the future with us. So we're actually looking to build a community that now really understands and appreciates wind. So sort of everyone's a salesman for us. And that includes even the finance community. So with new builds, the price of the wings is then put into the same pot as the ship, and it's all funded together. But actually, if you've got a vessel that's either got a current mortgage or not, and you want to add wings, then you've got to find a smaller loan to do that if you're not catch rich. So actually, we're building a community of those type of people to service some of the ship owners, as you quite rightly say. There's a lot more ship owners that own 5 ships than own 400 ships, and they actually hold a greater proportion of the fleet. It's almost reverse Pareto, as you say.
Yeah, and it also gets a little bit of FOMO, especially in certain communities. Greek ship owning community, certainly I would guess also in Japan, which is very traditional, which have great ships, but they don't change a lot. I had a guest on from Eno, and he was saying there's 3 or 4 forward-looking shipping companies, and the rest are very traditional. But they make up a big part of the fleet, and they have a design for a ship. It's worked well for 20 years. We're going to slightly improve that design and roll it right back out. Great ships, best in class, but embracing technology may take a little bit longer time, but it's certainly worth the effort, because if you get one or two of those folks, let's say from that area, or more traditional Greek ship owners, or even more traditional American ship owners with the couple that are around, I think you can start to get the ball rolling for sure. One of the things that I love to ask as we start to wrap up is, given your great background, your history, you said you made 3 trips over to the U.S. What are you reading these days? You must have a great variety of the type of things that you're reading. But what do you throw in the bag when you go visit?
So I've got 2 books on the go now. One's my normal trash go-to. I shouldn't say trash because he's a genius. It's John Grisham.
Oh, yeah, of course.
If I'm looking for a novel, it's always John Grisham. I know it's going to be about a lawyer in the Deep South, but I'm comfortable with that. That's fine. But actually, on the fact side, I'm reading a fascinating book called, I think it's Ian Dean, I think is his name, but it's called Dictators, and it's a collection of 64 biographies by 64 different people about 64 different dictators. So there's a passage about Augustus Caesar, and then there's a passage about Idi Amin, and there's a passage about, so it's an incredible warnings about don't let these people control your lives. So that's a fascinating read.
There was a similar book, I think, called About Fascism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you want to stay up all night, you're going to go read that one. Yeah. On top of the one that you read. I'm actually reading for no reason. I think other than there's such a big influx in it. I'm reading a book about venture capital. It was really interesting because you talk so much about venture capital in this setting and how that affects just growth and strategy and everything. And I figured, let me get educated on that. So that's an interesting thing. I'll drop the title in the link. But John, this was really interesting. Thank you so much for bringing your experience from outside the industry and your enthusiasm from outside the industry into our industry. And certainly in a way that, if you think about it, makes sense. F1 to America's Cup to ships that are Newcastle Maxes bringing coal or whatever they bring around the world. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a great chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I really enjoyed chatting to you. It's a really good experience for me too.